You stand at the edge of a battlefield in November 1918. The ground is torn, lifeless, soaked in the blood of millions. The war to end all wars has just ended, but victory feels hollow. You hear no cheers, only silence, broken by the distant groan of survivors returning from trenches. Europe has burned itself to the bone. Millions are dead. Millions more are maimed, traumatized, or orphaned. The air is thick with mourning and rage. You follow the leaders of the Allied powers as they gather to decide what comes next. Woodrow Wilson, idealistic and eager to craft a new world order. Georges Clemenceau, the French tiger, burning with the desire to punish. David Lloyd George, walking the line between justice and pragmatism. These men and the nations they represent are not just negotiating peace. They are sculpting the future, and they are doing it in the halls of a palace that once symbolized royal arrogance, Versailles. But before they can write a treaty, they must write the story of the war. Who started it? Who must pay? The answer they give is not objective. It is political. You watch as Article 231 takes shape, the War Guilt Clause, laying full responsibility for the conflict on Germany's shoulders. The German Empire has collapsed. Its Kaiser fled into exile. And yet it is Germany, the nation, the people that must be held accountable. In this moment, history becomes weaponized. You see the motives. Clemenceau's France, scarred by invasion twice in living memory, demands revenge. Lloyd George's Britain wants to cripple German naval power and protect its own empire. Wilson, with his 14 points, speaks of peace without victory, but his voice grows weaker. The old world is not ready for idealism. As the armistice takes effect, Germany expects a negotiated peace. After all, they surrendered before Allied troops crossed into Berlin. But what they receive is not negotiation, it is imposition. Germany is not invited to draft the treaty. They are summoned to sign it. The German delegation arrives in June 1919 to the Hall of Mirrors. You feel the weight of symbolism. This is where Germany proclaimed its empire in 1871. Now, in the same hall, that empire is being dismantled. The treaty laid before them is harsh, uncompromising. The shock is immediate. Germany must cede vast territories, Alsace-Lorraine to France, parts of Prussia to Poland. Its overseas colonies are stripped away. The Rhineland is to be demilitarized. Its army is reduced to 100,000 men. No air force.
No submarines.
And then there are the reparations, billions of gold marks. The German economy, already weakened, will be crushed under this weight for generations. You hear the German outcry. This is not peace. They say. It is a 20-year armistice. They are not wrong. And yet, from the outside, the treaty is celebrated. In Paris, London, and Washington, people cheer. The war is over. The map of Europe is redrawn. New nations are born, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the restored Poland. But behind the celebration is a truth too few are willing to face. This peace is fragile, uneven, and bitter. Inside Germany, you feel the ground shifting. The monarchy has fallen, replaced by a democratic government, the Weimar Republic. But this republic is born under foreign bayonets, forced to sign a treaty its people despise. You see the crowds in Berlin, angry, betrayed. They call the signatories November criminals. To them, the Treaty of Versailles is not an end, it is an open wound. The economy reels. Political factions erupt, communists on the left, nationalists on the right. Paramilitary groups roam the streets. The old order is broken. The new one is unsteady. And in the shadows, men begin to whisper. They say Germany didn't lose the war on the battlefield, but was stabbed in the back by politicians, by socialists, by Jews. The stab-in-the-back myth takes root, not as fact, but as fuel. The Allies believe they've crafted justice, but what they've created is something more dangerous. A martyr complex wrapped in national pride. You walk through the next months and years, watching Germany try to breathe beneath the weight of Versailles. The democratic government, eager to move forward, is haunted by the treaty it had no choice but to sign. Each payment it makes, each concession it fulfills, chips away at public confidence. The treaty becomes more than a document, it becomes a symbol of humiliation. Across Europe, wounds remain. France fortifies its borders, suspicious and vengeful. Britain returns to its empire, hoping to forget. The United States retreats into isolation, having rejected the very League of Nations Wilson fought to build. Versailles was meant to prevent another war. But you begin to feel it. Beneath the surface, something is stirring. The peace is brittle, the hatred unresolved, the blame eternal. And in one of the beer halls of Munich, a failed artist and wounded soldier listens carefully. He takes notes. He remembers every clause of the treaty. You now enter the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles once more, not as an observer of ceremony, but as a witness to humiliation. It is June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The irony burns. Where once Germany declared its imperial triumph, now it is forced to kneel. You stand beside the German delegation. Their faces are pale, drawn. They have no say.
Nonigo uściaszczyn.
Only signatures. As they put pen to paper, they are not only surrendering land, resources, and lives, they are surrendering dignity. Outside, Allied leaders smile for the cameras. Inside, a storm is forming. The Treaty of Versailles, at first glance, is a legal document. But for you, and for millions of Germans, it becomes something else, a monument to national disgrace. The language of the treaty is cold and precise, but its consequences are deeply human. You begin to feel the fracture it causes, not just in politics, but in identity. Germany is now a republic, but a wounded one. It is trying to walk while its legs are still broken. You see its army gutted, its pride demolished, and its economy gasping for air. The reparations alone, 132 billion gold marks, are astronomical. You hear voices on the streets, cursing the treaty, cursing the government that signed it, cursing the future they now fear. In 1921, the first reparations payments are demanded. Germany begins printing money to meet the crushing debt. What follows is one of the worst hyperinflation crises in modern history. You walk through Berlin and see women carrying baskets of cash that can't buy a loaf of bread. Savings vanish overnight. A wheelbarrow of marks buys a newspaper. Children play with banknotes as if they're toys. But it isn't a game. This collapse. Amid this chaos, extremist ideologies bloom like weeds. You watch the fringes gain strength. Communists promising revolution, nationalists demanding vengeance. And within this mess, a former corporal from the Great War begins to speak louder. His name is Adolf Hitler. You first see him in the early 1920s, standing atop a beer hall table in Munich, shouting at a crowd of disillusioned men. His voice is hoarse, his gestures sharp, his gaze burning. He doesn't speak of policy, he speaks of pain, of betrayal, of humiliation. He calls the Treaty of Versailles a crime. He says Germany was not defeated but betrayed. And he says he will avenge it. At first, you dismiss him. Just another angry veteran. Just another nationalist with delusions. But something about him is different. He knows how to tap into something primal. He speaks to wounded pride, to lost honor. He offers a target. The Allies, the Weimar government, the Jews, the communists. Anyone who can be blamed for Germany's decline. In 1923, you follow him as he launches a failed coup, the beer hall putsch. He's arrested, imprisoned. Most think that's the end. But even in prison, he is calculating. He writes Mein Kampf, his manifesto. It is filled with rage, racial theory, and most importantly, revenge. The treaty is not just a grievance in his eyes. It is a foundation for revolution. Meanwhile, Germany struggles to breathe. International loans from America under the Dawes Plan provide temporary relief. By the mid-1920s, there is a flicker of recovery. But Versailles is still there, hanging over every decision, every negotiation, every debate. You hear it constantly invoked by politicians, by teachers, by parents at the dinner table. It has become part of the national psyche. In 1929, the Great Depression hits, and everything breaks again. You see factories shut down, unemployment skyrocket, despair return with a vengeance. And this time Hitler is ready. The Nazi Party begins to rise, not just with words, but with votes. By 1930, they are a serious political force. Hitler is no longer a fringe speaker. He is a contender. And all along, the treaty is his fuel. He calls it a humiliation, a lie, a wound. He promises to tear it apart, to restore Germany, to rebuild the military, to reclaim the lost lands, to make Germany great again. You hear the cheering grow louder, especially among the youth who never knew a Germany before Versailles. To them, this is history and injustice. The Democratic Party's fracture. The Weimar government becomes paralyzed. In 1932, Hitler runs for president. He loses, but his message spreads. 1 year later, he is appointed chancellor. And now you feel it. Everything he promised, the rage, the revenge, it begins to manifest. The treaty becomes his justification for rearmament, for censorship, for control. He withdraws Germany from the League of Nations. He increases military spending. He sends troops into the Rhineland in 1936, directly violating Versailles. But no one stops him. Britain and France, weary of war, look away. They call it appeasement. You call it opportunity. Versailles, once intended to preserve peace, is now being used to ignite a new war. You see it clearly. Hitler does not want to erase the treaty. He wants to use it, to tell Germans they are victims, to tell the world that he is reclaiming what was stolen. And as he speaks, crowds roar. Arms rise. History begins to repeat. You recall the warning, once dismissed. This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. It was prophetic. You now find yourself walking the streets of Weimar Germany in the early 1930s. The shadows are long, and so are the lines at the soup kitchens. The streets are filled not with revolutionaries or soldiers, but with the unemployed, the broken, the disillusioned. Their eyes are hollow. Their wallets are empty. Their future, uncertain. And into that void steps a man who has already studied this pain, memorized its cadence, and weaponized its story.
Adolf Hitler.
You see him now not just as a fringe radical, but as a phenomenon. His speeches are no longer confined to Munich beer halls. They fill public squares. His party, once a joke to the political elite, is now Germany's second-largest force. And the one idea he returns to, again and again, is the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty becomes more than a grievance. It becomes the spine of his worldview. Every suffering German, he insists, is a victim of it. Every political failure, every economic hardship, every shred of national embarrassment, it all traces back to 1919. And with every speech, every rally, you feel it sink deeper into the national bloodstream. The treaty is no longer just a memory. It is a mythology. But it is more than that. It is a tool. You observe Hitler's brilliance not just in rhetoric, but in timing. He doesn't attack everything at once. He isolates targets. First, he vilifies the politicians who signed Versailles, the November criminals. Then, he targets the Weimar system that upheld the treaty's terms. Finally, he expands the blame. The international bankers, the Marxists, the Jews, anyone who he claims benefited from Germany's collapse. You see this pattern unfold with chilling clarity. It is not just politics, it is theater. Every speech, every banner, every newspaper headline is designed to touch raw nerves. People who lost sons in the war. People who lost homes in hyperinflation. People who never believed their country deserved to lose. And he doesn't offer abstract hope. He offers restoration. He promises jobs, dignity, greatness. But most of all, he promises revenge. By 1933, Hitler is chancellor. Not by revolution, but by appointment through a democratic system too fragile to stop him. And once inside the machinery of power, he dismantles it with ruthless efficiency. You watch the Reichstag burn. You see the enabling act passed. Democracy dies not with a bang, but with a signature. Hitler no longer needs to ask for power. He now holds it absolutely. The Treaty of Versailles becomes central to his propaganda machine. You see it in textbooks, films, newspapers. It is everywhere. Students are taught that Germany was stabbed in the back. Workers are told they were robbed. Soldiers are told they were betrayed. Hitler doesn't erase Versailles. He magnifies it over and over until it is no longer a document, but a scar that justifies everything. You notice the military parades begin again. Uniforms return. Weapons are produced. And with each step, each tank, each violation of the treaty, Hitler's popularity soars. In 1935, he announces the reintroduction of conscription, open defiance of Versailles. In 1936, he marches troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone. France and Britain protest but do nothing. He learns from this. The world, still nursing the wounds of the Great War, is unwilling to confront another. So he keeps going. But you understand, this isn't just about military strength. This is about rewriting humiliation into glory. You walk into a Berlin sports stadium in 1936, during the Olympic Games. The city gleams. Banners wave. The world watches and sees a new Germany. Confident, proud, reborn. But behind the gold medals and smiling hosts lies a darker truth. Camps have already begun to open. Political enemies have vanished. The SS expands. The Gestapo listens. And the Treaty of Versailles is still being invoked, not as a warning but as a rallying cry. Hitler tells the people, "We suffered. Now we rise." And they believe him. You move forward to 1938. The annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, takes place without a single shot. Crowds cheer as Nazi flags replace Austrian ones. The world watches again and does nothing. Next comes Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland is claimed under the guise of protecting ethnic Germans. Again, no war, just words. Appeasement. The Treaty of Versailles, once a binding post-war agreement, has become a broken contract. You realize something chilling. Hitler is not simply rejecting the treaty. He is reversing it piece by piece. Everything Versailles tried to prevent, military expansion, territorial conquest, nationalist aggression, he is now achieving with popular support. And the world, fearing another war, keeps retreating. In 1939, the final illusion shatters. Hitler invades Poland. France and Britain, cornered, declare war. The Second World War begins. You look back at Versailles, at the signatures in the Hall of Mirrors, at the promises of peace, and you see the connection clear, direct, undeniable. The treaty did not create Hitler, but it built the stage, provided the script. It gave him his villain, his story, his justification. It turned a failed artist into a prophet of vengeance. And you begin to understand the deeper tragedy. The attempt to prevent another war had, in its very design, made that war inevitable. You now stand in the heart of Berlin, 1940. The city is adorned with banners bearing the swastika. Statues rise. Crowds roar. The air is heavy not just with smoke from industrial production, but with the weight of history repeating itself. Hitler is at the peak of his power, and you know how he got here. You recall the Treaty of Versailles and realize how skillfully he transformed shame into strength. In the early years of Nazi rule, Hitler used the treaty as both a villain and a mirror. Every repressive clause, every punishment, every humiliation once written into that document became a cornerstone of his ideology. The treaty was his proof that Germany had been wronged. Morally, politically, historically. And now he was writing his own terms. The war is expanding. Poland is conquered. France falls. Britain is bombed. The very nations that once dictated the conditions of Versailles are now being brought to their knees. To Hitler and many of his supporters, this isn't just conquest. It's retribution. Versailles is not forgotten. It is being avenged. You see this vengeance unfold in speeches, in rallies, in textbooks. Hitler doesn't hide it, he broadcasts it. He refers to Versailles again and again, telling Germans, "They tried to destroy us. Now we take back what is ours." He erases borders, reclaims lands, redefines power. But something has changed. You feel the transformation of Versailles from national grievance to ideological fuel. The treaty, in Hitler's hands, is no longer just about territory or reparations. It becomes a moral license for authoritarianism. He uses its memory to justify dictatorship, to extinguish opposition, to commit atrocities. Because if Germany is the victim, then anything can be permitted in the name of justice. You walk through occupied territories. You hear the German language replace native tongues. You see Jewish homes marked and looted. You watch as dissent is crushed and loyalty rewarded. The Nazi regime doesn't just undo Versailles, it uses it to remake the world in its own image. And yet, you begin to hear the cracks. Not all Germans support what is happening. Some remember that the Republic, however flawed, offered freedom. Others grow uneasy at the brutality, the extremism, the sheer speed of expansion. But by now, Hitler has silenced nearly every dissenting voice. Versailles has done its part, it gave him his rise. Now fear and force keep him there. Then the tide begins to turn. The invasion of the Soviet Union stalls. The United States enters the war. German cities burn under Allied bombs. The grand vision of a restored empire begins to collapse. And yet, even in defeat, Hitler does not stop invoking the treaty. As Berlin crumbles, he speaks of betrayal once again, of enemies encircling Germany just like they did after World War I. He dies still blaming others, still referencing Versailles, still clinging to the myth that Germany's suffering justified his power. When the war ends, the world returns to the ruins, just as it did in 1918. But this time, the lesson is not just about peace, it is about what kind of peace. You listen as leaders gather again, not in Versailles, but in San Francisco, Potsdam, and Yalta. They speak cautiously now. They know that humiliation breeds monsters, that unchecked blame turns into ideology, that revenge is a poor architect for peace. You see this understanding take shape in the post-war world. Germany is divided but also rebuilt. The Marshall Plan is not a punishment, it's an investment. The United Nations is formed, not as a victor's club, but as an attempt, however flawed, to create dialogue. But still, the shadow of Versailles lingers. Historians debate, politicians reference it, students study it, and you, having walked through the full arc, understand the power of memory. The Treaty of Versailles was not simply a document, it was a trigger. It weaponized national identity. It fostered grievance over growth. It made space for the rise of a man who promised dignity, but delivered destruction. You now return to the question that has followed you from part 1. Was Versailles a peace treaty or a time bomb? The answer is not simple. It depends on how you define peace. If peace means the absence of gunfire, then Versailles succeeded for 2 decades. But if peace means justice, balance, reconciliation, then Versailles failed catastrophically. And what of Hitler? Did he rise because of Versailles alone? No. But Versailles gave him the story. It gave him the audience. It gave him the language of betrayal that millions were desperate to hear. He didn't need to invent the wound. He only needed to promise that he would heal it, no matter the cost. You now look back at every clause of the treaty, every speech Hitler gave, every headline printed, every boot that marched in defiance of foreign-imposed humiliation. And you see how dangerous memory can be when molded by rage. This is not just a story about the past. It is a warning. Peace must be more than punishment. Justice must be more than revenge. And memory must be more than myth. Because if it isn't, history will not only repeat, it will escalate. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to secure peace after the devastation of World War I. Instead, it planted the seeds of resentment, humiliation, and division, especially in Germany, where its harsh terms became a source of national outrage. The treaty imposed crushing reparations, severe territorial losses, and moral condemnation through the infamous war guilt clause. These conditions crippled the German economy, destabilized the fledgling Weimar Republic, and created fertile ground for extremist ideologies.
Adolf Hitler,
a bitter veteran and fringe political agitator, recognized the emotional power of Versailles. He transformed the treaty into a symbol of betrayal and injustice, a rallying cry for national revival and vengeance. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Hitler used Versailles to fuel propaganda, vilify political opponents, and legitimize authoritarianism. His promises to undo the treaty's terms won him support from a population desperate for dignity and stability. By the time Hitler came to power, Versailles was no longer just a diplomatic document. It was the foundation of a dangerous ideology. Every violation of the treaty, from rearmament to territorial conquest, was framed as justice. Eventually, this narrative helped propel Europe into another, and far more catastrophic world war. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles did not bring lasting peace. It showed the world that a flawed peace can be as dangerous as war itself. And it proved that memory, when laced with pain and pride, can be weaponized to tragic effect.